minutes because we've got a lot of folks joining. Welcome. We're going to be starting now, even though we still have a lot of folks joining. I'd like to introduce Chris Armstrong from APG, Armstrong Process Group. Chris, over to you. Thank you and welcome.
Reference models and reference architectures. Apologies to those that may have thought that we were going to do a different one, which was the plan on architecture decision making, but we're going to defer that to a future date. So let's get on into it. Just a little bit about APG. Again, we play in the enterprise architecture, business modeling, improvement, systems engineering space. Contribute to a number of modeling specifications at the OMG and participate in a number of forums at the Open Group, such as TOGAF and Archibate, as well as participating as a committer to the Eclipse Process Framework Project at the Eclipse Foundation. And we also are partners with a number of tool vendors, including Spark Systems, Hewlett-Packard, and IBM. And so, the objectives for today's webinar are to, talk about some best practices on how we can use reference models for categorizing architecture content for different purposes. For example, for being able to do planning, lifecycle management, gap analysis, alignment, and line of sight across the enterprise. Talk about how reference architectures are used and how they're different but related to reference models. And one of the things that we're going to, really start off the discussion with is the irony, I think, that despite the fact that, I think we use these terms, reference models and reference architectures, very liberally and regularly in our profession, there is actually no clear understanding, at least that I could find, about what the two things are and how they're different, although there are some places that give some good indicators. I'll talk about how that relates a little bit to the concept of architecture and solution building blocks per TOGAF, and we'll take a look at some conceptual models that we've put together to help just kind of level the playing field about what is a reference model, what are the things that constitute a reference model, what is a reference architecture, what are the things that make that up, and again, how are those related? So, of course, trying to use some of our architecture best practices to help us get our arms around what the heck this architecture topic's all about. So for those of you that were not able to participate in the previous webinar where we introduced the enterprise architecture value chain and capability map, I just wanted to provide some context of, where does this whole reference model, reference architecture discussion fit into the big picture of this thing we call enterprise architecture. So I'm not going to, go through the gory details of the value chain. That was really the point of the last webinar, and certainly invite those that didn't participate to review the recording. But the idea that, at the end of the day, we're positioning that enterprise architecture is really trying to support this value chain of understanding kind of where we are, doing some analysis of the different forces that are causing us to, think about maybe doing things differently, where there might be opportunities for improvement, then making some decisions about what to do, and then actually responding and executing on those decisions. And then along the way, there's the whole idea of these supporting capabilities. And, we position reference models and reference architectures as a part of architecture knowledge management. So, again, there's the four top-level categories around modeling, reference models, requirements management, and reference architectures. And you'll notice that there's these two sections where we've got different kinds of reference models that we often use to, again, categorize the different kinds of content that we discover when we're doing architecture modeling. And then what the notion of the reference architectures that we might build based on those reference models for certain scenarios, like platform reference architectures that get to things like, J2E or .NET or mobile, SOA cloud reference architectures that are kind of platform architectures, but a little bit more abstract, that may perhaps maybe relate to architecture style. And then, of course, there are integration reference architectures, and this, again, is not meant to be an exhaustive list of all the types, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those might be in a little bit. But one of the ideas is that, since these are supporting capabilities, we don't build reference models just because we can build reference models, and we don't build reference architectures because we can. They're supposed to be things that, drive us towards another end, and that's really where, the value chain you saw on the previous slide comes into play. And what we haven't had a chance to put together, and maybe we'll make some progress on this in the upcoming months, is creating a clear capability specification. And again, that's a reference to last month's presentation on exactly what are the dependencies that those top-level EA capabilities have on these supporting capabilities of reference models and reference architectures. So, we'll start off with just doing a quick survey of some definitions that I've found by, using the world's greatest architecture repository that's out there, google.com. So took a look at certainly a venerable organization that we look to for guidance in the software space, particularly and architecture, the Software Engineering Institute. And out of the glossary that they have compiled, they describe a reference model as a division of functionality into elements together with the data flow amongst those elements. And, to be quite honest, I'm not quite sure what that really means. It seems a little bit too narrow, particularly as it relates to the notion of data flow. That is, I'd actually expect to see that more in what I would consider a reference architecture. But I'll make my claim why that may be a better way to look at it in a little bit. And then a reference architecture is defined as a model that's mapped onto software elements that implements the functionality defined in the reference model. So that's got some, I think, some good substance to it in the sense that the reference architecture, is mapped to a reference model. So that's a key point there. But, not surprising. I really, to be quite honest, I'm not sure the attribution of these definitions, where they came from. But, the focus on it being software elements is perhaps too narrow for enterprise architecture, although that may be a very frequent usage scenario. Then if we take a look at TOGAF, what does TOGAF have to say about it? This is actually, an explicit quote out of the standard, that, it's stated that the terms reference architecture and reference model are not used carefully in most literature, which I think I would certainly agree with. They're often used interchangeably. And so the TOGAF says, a reference architecture and a reference model have the same relationship as an architecture and a model, which I think may be true, but I don't think that's, again, real clear. And goes on to continue to say that, these things can either exist as generic or organization-specific models, and that a reference architecture provides the team with an outline of, an organization-specific architecture that's going to be customized for their particular needs. It does incorporate the OASIS SOA reference model definition, and we'll take a look at that next. And what I found, just as a little preview, is that OASIS, of all of the standards bodies that I was able to connect with, seemed to have the best definition and differentiation between the two terms reference model and reference architecture, because as many of you may know, those terms are used explicitly in some of the standards, particularly the OASIS reference model for SOA and the OASIS reference architecture for SOA. They are two different things. So OASIS talks about a reference model being an abstract framework for understanding the key relationships among the entities in some problem domain that may be used for the purpose of developing standards or specifications for that environment. And in that, it consists of some minimal set of unifying concepts and relationships that's independent of specific standards, technologies, or other details. And in the context of the reference model for SOA, it provides a common language for describing the important features of a SOA, but doesn't address the specific issues of how we're going to actually build or implement or operate such a system. So, I think the key thing that I take away from this is, again, it's a framework, a minimal set of concepts, and really, I think the last bullet, really calls out the most critical aspect of what a reference model is really trying to do, which is let's agree upon a common language for describing this problem domain. And as we all know from a lot of the work that we've done, particularly in software development, that it's pretty darn hard to get people to converge on a consensus on agreeing on a set of requirements when we're getting confused by the words that we're using. So ultimately, to me, I see a reference model often expressed as a taxonomy, but that's not the sole way, is really, again, trying to just pick arbitrary words that describe different parts of this domain as it relates to having a meaningful discussion about those things. We take a look at another standard that's out there, the Federal Enterprise Architecture from the Office of Management and Budget. Talks about a reference model that is a structure that allows things about systems to be described in a consistent fashion. Again, borrows heavily on the OASIS definition as it relates to an abstract framework and unifying concepts, and again, not being tied to any particular set of standards or technology or implementation details. So let's just take a quick look at, some of the excerpts out of some of these. And so here we see the reference model for a problem domain within SOA, the notion of a service description. And so service description, which is the first class element here on this diagram, and of course, if people are interested in more details, please go look at the reference at the bottom of the slide where you can download the standard and get all the good stuff. But that, the service description is informed by things like, what is the service itself, how is it accessed via interfaces, its visibility and accessibility, what functionality does it provide, how does it interact both behaviorally and from an information perspective, and what kind of agreements and contracts and policies govern its operation and development. So again, basically trying to say, when we're thinking about the service description part of the SOA problem domain, these are the 10 or so concepts that are important for us to understand. If we take a look at a way a reference model often used in enterprise architecture, particularly in the technology lifecycle management space, here we see an example of a technology reference model, which again is ultimately a taxonomy for classifying different kinds of technology components. And this is being represented here in kind of a nested box diagram where we have top-level areas like document management and database, security, application development. And then within each one of those areas, there's a second level of a hierarchy that have to do with categories of technology, such as, database development, database platform, video, wireless, logging for security, code analysis for application development, and and perhaps many of you have employed such techniques for kind of getting your arms around the different kinds of technology within your organization. But ultimately, this is just a way to say, hey, if I identify a particular technology product like Microsoft SQL Server, 2008, what kind of technology is that? And we can associate it with one of these categories, which then may carry with it additional issues around ownership, standard products, whether this is an accepted standard, an emerging standard, or something that's being contained or retired. So this is how we often end up using reference models to help us do lifecycle management and lifecycle governance. And here, again, here we see, that technology reference model populated with, again, the actual technology products themselves. So here we're seeing application development. There's a number of different categories. So as it relates to perhaps application modeling, there's a number of rational products listed here where you can see that, rational software modeler 7 and XDE 7 are in containment. Version 6 is in retirement, but version 7 is our standard. So again, this is one of the typical ways that we employ a reference model, at least in technology lifecycle management. And as some of you might have guessed, these two different views were produced out of a architecture modeling tool. And one of the benefits, of such tools are the ability to render that content both graphically, like we saw on the previous slide, as well as in a tabular format like you're seeing here. And then we can actually take it down to a lower level of detail and graphically represent, again, as it relates to individual products, what is their life cycle state disposition. So here we're looking at the database technology space, and we can take a look at the database platform and see that there are a number of standard platforms as it relates to DB2, Oracle, and that SQL Server is being contained, and the old version SQL Server 2000 is being retired. One of the examples that we often use when we're talking to our clients about particularly technology reference models as a great public example is the technology reference model from the Department of Veterans Affairs in the U.S. government. And while APG, we had no hand in building such a thing, it's a great example of, again, in this case, a 3-level categorization scheme as opposed to the one we saw previously, which is 2 levels. And that's one of those arbitrary decisions, how many different levels should we have on our reference models? I tend to see that, there are 2 levels and 3 levels. And I probably should have put in a poll question about asking, for those of you that are out there that use reference models, well, how many levels do those hierarchies have? And I tend to see 2, I tend to see 3, not as frequently 4 or more, because we again want to make sure that we're not making things more complex than they need to be. And here we see, again, in this particular case, the technology domain of application technology, an area that has to do with application software, and a category, application servers themselves, again, a number of actual technology products. And as you'll see in a little bit, some more details about this. But this brings up a particular interesting observation about when we're doing a lot of our enterprise architecture, content management, and lifecycle management, that the things that are listed here in the rightmost column are often what people call, architecture standards. And according to TOGAF, that wouldn't be actually correct in this, and we'll talk a little bit about this in a couple slides. But the whole idea is that there's a specific definition of what an architecture building block is in TOGAF, that it relates to really a set of requirements, standards, or specifications. But there's a different kind of building block, as many of you may be familiar with, solution building blocks. And solution building blocks are actual products that implement and conform to those standards and specifications and requirements. And that's what we find most organizations invest in, which is not certainly inappropriate or wrong. It's just, I think, from a profession perspective, it's important to acknowledge that those things that we are calling standards really are standard technology products, i.e. solution building blocks. And I don't see many organizations really doing stuff, managing things at the architecture building block level. However, if you were to access this website, which again you can online, you'll notice if you scroll down, because it's of course very deep and rich, you'll eventually get to a different icon. So you'll notice that all of these products that are listed here have little wrenches next to them, and that's the VA symbol for basically a technology product. But there are some that are a little bit lower down in the list that have, I believe, flag icons, and those are actual standards such as HTML, HTTP, SSL, UML, so on and so forth. But one of the other nice things about the VA TRM is it goes more than just lists the the categorization scheme and the products that fit within each category. It also, when you click on an individual product, it will show you information about the vendor's disposition to its availability and end of life and end of mainstream support. Version by version, but then also a disposition as it relates to the end user organization on, is a particular version of the product, in this case, is it being supported, is it being, contained or deprecated? And one of the things that I find particularly informative about this example is that they have a state that's something that I often don't see elsewhere, is the whole idea of prohibited. I mean, there's just no way you're going to be allowed to do this, so don't even think about that. And of course, those life cycle states have a lot to do with the kind of the value system and culture of the organization, that's the governance is being performed in. Then another set of reference models come out of the OMB's Federal Enterprise Architecture. There's a set of 5 reference models around performance management, business capabilities, service definition, data, and technology. And we're going to take a quick look at the service reference model that's comprised of a 3-level hierarchy of service domain, service types, and service components. But one of the call-outs that I'd like to make here is that this has actually been superseded by a new version of FEA and a different set of reference models. But, you know, despite that, I still think this is, again, a great example that's publicly available. If you go to the OMB's FEA's website, you can download the latest content as well as this in the archive. But here's an example, again, of a snippet of the FEA's service reference model, focusing on, again, in this case, one of the service domains, back office services, the second level of categories, data management, HR, asset management, and then the third level, the service components of things like data exchange, recruiting, or time reporting, debt collection, so on and so forth. And like I foreshadowed a little bit earlier, you know, in the context of what's called the enterprise continuum in TOGAF, and I'll certainly, you know, defer to the standard there for more explanation of this, or perhaps this could be a topic of a future webinar. But the whole idea is that the enterprise continuum is comprised of two different sets of content, the architecture continuum and the solutions continuum. And the whole idea is that the architecture continuum, as you know, I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised, is what is used to represent the architecture building blocks. Again, the standards, specifications, and requirements that guide and direct the implementation of those in the business and IT operations as solution building blocks. And we'll find actually when we take a look at the conceptual model for this is actually a third level that APG and others have thought about extending the sense of these repositories in TOGAF, is the idea of the operations continuum, which is where we actually store representations of the instances of executing elements. And in many organizations, at least in the IT space, that would be best represented by a configuration management database. So again, here we see the, a view of the TOGAF enterprise repositories. And one of the things that, again, isn't real clear at first glance is, so we've got that enterprise continuum thing and different kinds of building blocks, but how does that relate to these different kinds of architecture content that we're concerned about? And so, here we just have a simple mapping where we've really explicitly called out that the standards information base that's a part of the architecture repository is where the architecture building blocks go. And that solution building blocks are stored in what's called the solutions repository with some affinity to the products that they're based upon. And then the operations repository, that's actually an extension that APG's added to this viewpoint, is where, again, we actually represent the operating infrastructure, and we're calling those operational building blocks. But of course, you'll notice that one of the other sections of the architecture repository is the reference library that is comprised of reference architectures, reference models, templates, and a viewpoint library. And again, ironically, despite the fact that those words are being used here on this picture, they aren't clearly defined elsewhere within the TOGAF standard. But at least there's, again, a recognition that reference models and reference architectures are certainly a part of that content that we want to manage in the architecture repository. So here on slide 20, we see an example of, the semantics and concepts, that are making up what we call a reference model. So, if we take a look here, we've got the notion of a reference model, which of course is a type of model. It's related to some domain of interest. This could be a technology domain, a application domain, a business domain. Could be a different vertical, a different kind of technology platform. And one of the things that we need to understand is what kind of reference model is it, and there's an enumeration in the upper left-hand corner that suggests at least 3 different ways that these reference models are expressed, possibly as ontologies, meta models. But what I find most frequent in practice are taxonomies, and many people will use, for example, a UML class diagram to represent those taxonomies using generalization and specialization relationships. But the idea is that reference model may refer to a set of quality attributes that have to do with, describing the goodness of different parts of the reference model and what it's supposed to be delivering. But, ultimately that reference model is comprised of a set of reference model elements. And those elements, again, may be hierarchical in nature. That's where we get into, like, for example, in the federal enterprise architecture, the idea of service domains, service areas, and service components. Those are the three different levels that are described. There may be some relationships amongst those reference model elements. However, it's also important to understand, how does the reference model elements relate to a governance, and this is the idea of a managed model element, the idea that there's someone who's an owner of a particular part of the reference model that's concerned about understanding and controlling the status or life cycle state related to that. So that's, again, the whole idea that a managed model element typically has a life cycle model that's comprised of a set of life cycle states, like in research, being developed, is a standard, being contained, and being retired. And depending on the level of abstraction of the associated content model, so that's, again, kind of the whole idea, is that we typically then have an actual architectural model that maps to a reference model. And so that content model might be, again, a set of technology components. It could be a set of business capabilities. And those would be the models that those first-class models you'd be building for your stakeholders based on stakeholder concerns. And that content model, of course, is summarily also comprised of a set of content model elements that may also have relationships. But again, the whole idea is that we expect, if we're really trying to categorize things, that those content model elements are going to be related to reference model elements through some sort of assignment. And then, again, a particular part of a reference model, particularly if it's being managed, also may have a set of quality attribute values that have to do with, what kinds of things are we hoping to see within our enterprise as we govern this part of, for example, of the database technology category, as it relates to performance requirements, availability requirements, service level agreements, so on and so forth. And so, and then again, maybe one thing to, again, roll back and talk about is the reference model usage, which you see between content model and reference model, that, again, we're using this to do mapping or categorization, or we're using it to do gap analysis. So, for example, a lot of times you'll take an industry standard reference model. This is something we do quite a bit of at APG. We'll take some of the conceptual reference models that are in TOGAF, like the architecture development method, which is really a high-level process classification scheme, or the architecture repository diagram that we saw earlier, and then use that as a way to say, well, does an end-user organization, do you perform activities that are in the architecture vision phase, yes or no? Do you do things in phase E, opportunities and solutions? Do you actually have a solutions repository or a viewpoint library? So again, those are some of the ways that we kind of get an assessment based on best practices of how close our organization, how our current organization's implementation maps to some of those industry standards. And then we get on to reference architectures. So again, ultimately, I've observed reference models are usually some sort of classification scheme, again, for the purposes of doing categorization, mapping, or gap analysis. But reference architectures provide even more value, in my experience, by taking a little bit further. And so let's, start about, talking about OASIS's definition of a reference architecture. And, the first couple of words here at the top, I think, crystallize the intent that a reference architecture may be a architectural design pattern. So I think that's the key thing, design pattern, that describes how these different abstract set of elements that are described in the reference model that are, related to one another in order to realize a certain set of outcomes based on a set of requirements in a particular domain. Again, independent of specific technologies and products that might be used to implement them. And again, the claim that OASIS makes is that the reference models, our reference architectures are different than reference models, and that the reference models, again, are really focusing on the concepts and some of the key relationships, but that the reference architecture is really about solving problems. again, shows a more complete picture that represents how are we going to take some of those concepts that are represented in the reference model to solve a particular sort of solution. And there's an acknowledgement that we can define reference architectures at different levels of detail or abstraction. These things aren't necessarily concrete architectures, but that may depend on the level of abstraction. And depending on the scope, the reference architectures may not represent every single thing that you mean to do, but the most critical, important parts of addressing a problem domain's requirements. So here we have just an example of, how OASIS is kind of positioning this, the idea that, if at the top of the screen, things tend to be more abstract, where things at the bottom are more concrete. And we basically see here at the very top that there is a reference model that is used to provide guidance to the development of reference architectures and patterns, with the idea that then we derive concrete implementations of our architectures from those reference architectures using the models as guidance. And this, again, allows us to account for some of our, the reason we're doing all this as it relates to requirements and goals, and the consideration of some of the constraints we might be placed under as it relates to protocols and standards. So here we just see a small snippet out of the OASIS reference architecture for SOA around social structure. And the whole idea is that each one of these boxes, again, is identified in the reference model. But here in the reference architecture, we're really talking about configurations. How do we take those concepts that are in the reference architecture that really help us understand how are they related to one another, what kind of interactions do they have in the context of trying to solve a particular set of problems. So again, I really look at, reference architectures are really kind of getting into more configurations of content that are described in reference models. So let's just take a quick look at some other reference architectures. Of course, there's a number of those that come out of the Open Group. So since we're talking about SOA, let's take a look at the Open Group's SOA reference architecture. And again, there's a high-level classification scheme that really, to me, represents the reference model portion of this, about interfaces, processes, service, components, and systems, with some other considerations around qualities, date, content, and governance. But here we see, really, again, the reference model part of the reference architecture, that there's some things that we need to concern ourselves with service delivery, like the solution component itself, integration controllers, quality of service enforcers, the things that comprise the runtime environment, or virtualization and infrastructure services. But then we actually get into, a more clear definition of, and this is what I would really consider more of that configuration part of the reference architecture, is showing how these different things should be related to one another when you're actually trying to construct a solution, in this particular problem domain. So a solution component is related to an implementation controller that has a relationship to things around quality as a service, and potentially integration with applications, legacy systems, and databases, and that the solution component is actually deployed based on a solution platform, hosted in some sort of environment, on some infrastructure and hardware, and then there's some qualities of service management surrounding all of that part of the stack. So, one of the things that I think is, important to acknowledge is, where does all this stuff fit into some of the standards that are out there around architectural modeling and architecture description? And I imagine many of you guys might be familiar with a standard called ISO/IEC 42010, formerly known as IEEE 1471. And this standard, basically tries to get down to, what is the idea of an architecture description, and trying to make it real clear that there is a difference between a architecture description and the architecture itself. So, an architecture exists whether or not we understand it, which is the whole rationale for, why we want to put together an architecture description. So based on, but what 4210, helps us focus on is why are we building an architecture description? And again, it's based on the idea that we just don't build architecture descriptions because we have architecture tools that allow us to do that, that they need to be fit for purpose. And this is where I see a lot of organizations really struggle, is making sure that they take that step back and say, okay, we as a profession understand that building models of various flavors has value, but you know, if we don't really understand who are the people that care, and of course, a lot of times those are the people that pay for it and sponsor our investments, but not exclusively limited to those. What concerns do they have about the problem domain? And based on those concerns, you know, let's frame them up with what are called architecture viewpoints, which is a way of looking at the content in a set of architectural models that allows us to construct, again, what we call an architecture view, where, again, there are, at least TOGAF suggests there are perhaps at least 3 fundamental types of architecture viewpoints: diagrams for graphical representation, catalogs, which are really tabular reports, as well as matrices. And you know, our experience and perhaps yours suggests that's certainly not the extent of architecture description viewpoints, but certainly some of the most fundamental ones. But we also expect to see other things like we saw earlier, heat maps, and potentially dashboards and other types of visualizations. So if we take a look at, you know, reference architectures, we, you know, abstracted it up even a little bit higher in trying to get a grip on, I think, what this really was trying to get to, which was the idea that a reference architecture is really a way of configuring a set of elements in a reference model as it relates to solving certain kinds of problems. But that notion of configuring content is not limited just to reference architectures. And so that's why we came up with this word that perhaps many of you haven't heard before, because, well, we kind of just made it up, a reference configuration, and that there are perhaps multiple types of reference configurations. And you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner some enumerations that talk about what the different types are. And those would be an architecture, a reference architecture, a reference design, and a reference implementation. With the idea that a reference design is really an accommodation for what we probably most typically would call a design pattern. So a reference configuration is a type of architecture description, which is the whole idea of why we wanted to set the context of 4210 before. And again, you know, that we don't build reference architectures or reference implementations or design patterns because we got nothing else to do. It's because they're supposed to be useful to help us solve problems. And that's where we need to understand the relationship of a reference configuration to a content model. So whether that's a business process model, a configuration model, an IT service management, an infrastructure model of the architecture landscape, whatever that, you know, again, subject of interest is. But the idea that, you know, we use reference configurations for perhaps, you know, at least 3 purposes that are also shown in the enumeration on the lower right. We use it to help us derive more fit-for-purpose solutions. We expect the reference configuration to be used to instantiate an actual operational execution that would typically be most related to a reference implementation, where basically you'd say, hey, if you're trying to do, you know, gold level service for application delivery, it's going to, you know, require this application server configured with this kind of operating system running on this kind of hardware with this kind of memory, this kind of data access and data redundancy. So we have the whole idea that, you know, we could pre-configure some of those patterns as reference implementations and then allow people to substitute at runtime or deployment time the actual instances, IP addresses and server names of those things that are going to instantiate that reference implementation. We also might be using reference configurations for conformance because perhaps we've come up with a reference architecture for J2EE or for SOA or for call centers, and we want to make sure that as other parts of our organization uplift those capabilities, they're doing it in conformance with the reference architecture that we've built, with the whole idea that that reference architecture is based on a set of principles. This is one of the other things that we've often seen accompany particularly reference architectures. And the idea being based on this reference architecture was designed and synthesized based on adhering to these principles, and that's what you see in the upper right-hand corner. And those principles, of course, we recommend you follow the TOGAF specification where you describe them not with just a name, but also a statement, a set of rationale, and a set of implications. But also the whole idea that the reference configuration is supposed to achieve a certain set of goals, may have associated with it a set of quality attributes, as well as a set of requirements. But the whole idea is that, again, the reference configuration is comprised of a set of elements. Those elements are types of reference model elements. So there's where we kind of see the mapping between the reference configuration and the reference model. And again, getting that back to the content models that they're actually trying to categorize. So in conclusion, what we found is that reference models we use to represent, again, the properties of elements in a particular subject area or domain of interest. Reference architectures really represent configurations of those elements in the reference model that are created to address a specific set of requirements based on a certain set of guiding principles. And again, this could possibly be set as a set of patterns or a pattern language. Those content model elements can be mapped to the elements of the reference model for organization, categorization, complexity management purposes, and often are used for helping us manage and govern related elements of certain types of models, and that we can take elements of our content models and use them to configure instantiations, again, of those reference architectures as it relates to deploying these solutions into the real world. So, that's we're a little bit done a little bit early, but if we have a little bit some questions, we probably could have some interaction there. But just wanted to at least wrap things up and thank everybody for attending, and as an appreciation for that, if people are interested in continuing their professional development around enterprise architecture, we have a 25% discount promotion for AEA members on our web-based training. So you can go to the link you see on this page to get a sample of what that looks like. And if you have any additional questions about that or anything else, don't hesitate to contact us. Again, this has been the second session in the Building an Architecture Platform webinar series, and certainly are very glad and appreciate the opportunity that the AEA has provided us to share this information with the community. So, thinking that we're going to be, looking at the architecture decision-making topic for the next one, presumably in January, but additional topics around the consumption and reuse of architectural assets, concepts around continuous architecture, agile enterprise architecture, some new things coming out from the open group, IT for IT, and how that relates to enterprise architecture, EA tools, information risk management, and PCI, and things around more details in the TOGAF architecture repository. So I wanted to, again, thank everybody for your kind attention and participation. And if we have any questions that have been submitted or any review that people would like to discuss, I'd be happy to take that under consideration now.
Yeah, hi all. You can send your questions to Chris.
So there's one question out there that, what is the difference between a reference model, reference architecture, and reference configuration? And so, of course, I might have gone a little bit too meta modelly and semantic overkill, but of course, having an affinity for modeling, I just cannot restrain myself. So, ultimately, what I've observed is that, again, reference models tend to be 2 to 3 level hierarchies for categorizing things. So, for example, if we were to go back to an earlier slide, take a look at, see, what do we got here? I think this may be a good representation. So here we've got, again, 2 levels to categorize things, areas and categories, and then we actually have the things. So the technology components make up the content model, and the technology area and categories make up the reference model. And then again, this is typically used to just kind of list a bunch of things and just make it easier to kind of manage the diversity of things we see in a particular environment. And in this particular case, again, using the categorization scheme as a focal point for, based on this category of technology, what are our standards technology products, which ones are being maintained, and which ones are being retired. So again, relating to lifecycle management and governance. The reference architectures are trying to take it a little bit further, and so this is perhaps not a great part of the model to demonstrate, but let me go see if I can find a different part. But, the whole idea might be for something like this. Here we have, 6 or 7 technology categories, and a reference architecture might describe how a database platform needs to be related to something that does data modeling, data performance management, and data administration. So the reference architecture would take these, second level boxes and show them how they're related to one another. And I think we have another example a little bit later from the open group SOA reference architecture, where again, the boxes on this picture are perhaps the leaf nodes in the reference model taxonomy. And again, those may be used to categorize actual implementations and products. But the reference architecture, again, is showing the explicit recommended relationships to use those types of products to deliver a successful solution. Let's see, we have another question around what's the best tool to manage reference models and reference architectures. And of course, that may be related to, one of the polling questions is, what kind of tools are people out there using? And I would say, as you probably wouldn't be surprised, the preponderance of people, I think, represent their reference models, and actually something that's not on there, using PowerPoint. So there often isn't an explicit representation. Maybe there's a Visio diagram. And, of course, this is a call out to the world's most popular enterprise architecture modeling platform, Microsoft Office, which, is better than a paper napkin because at least you can, digitize it and email it to people. But, what we found is that a lot of organizations maybe do a little bit of stuff in Visio, maybe some stuff in Excel, some SharePoint sites, support that with some Word documents. But as I'm sure many of you that have done that and perhaps still are doing that, that can make the the maintenance and exploitation of that content really hard to take advantage of. So we recommend using some sort of modeling tool. Our preferred solution, but of course that's based on our partnership, is Spark Systems Enterprise Architect. Is a great way to represent the taxonomies, represent the mapping of elements to those taxonomies. As well as, it has, like many other modeling tools, such as Rational Software Architect or Rhapsody or others that are out there, to create what are called patterns that most of these modeling tools have the ability to actually instantiate reference architectures by being, again, allow you to pre-configure, hey, if you're trying to solve this kind of problem, I want to package this as a particular sort of pattern, make that available to my practitioners, and all they need to do then is drag and drop that pattern onto an empty diagram, and then what the tool does is pops up and says, oh, okay, well, this reference architecture or design pattern says you need to specify, you know, what the observer is and what the subscriber is and what the subject of interest is, because the reference model defines those three terms. The reference architecture describes how they're supposed to be related, but you need to tell me the instances of the elements in your content model that you want to substitute here. So we find there's, again, a natural affinity that if we're going to be building our content models in some sort of modeling tool, that it makes a lot of sense to build our reference architectures and reference models using similar sort of technologies. However, we do want to be careful about over-emphasizing modeling, because at the end of the day, my experience tells me that there's many of us in the architecture profession that get a lot of value out of that modeling activity. A vast majority of the enterprise does not, because either they don't care about models, or they don't know they're supposed to care about models, or the notation or graphical representation isn't very helpful. So that's where we like to really extend the capabilities of these, what we call EA content management tools, which is what a modeling tool really is, to integrate it into a more diverse, broad ecosystem through a lifecycle management tool, which often, you know, the best practice that us and other vendors have observed is that presenting that content to the rest of the enterprise through a web browser makes a lot of sense, but we'd want that to be actually connected to managed, governed content that's represented with formal specifications in our actual modeling tools. So, hope that was a long-winded response, but hopefully informative. There's one more question up here that has to do with you know, does a reference architecture have a life cycle? And I would suggest that it absolutely should, particularly because the reference architecture should be connected to, you know, or again, as a representation of a subset of elements in the reference model. The reference model, again, is used to do governance, or often is used to do governance, and particularly as it relates to more not perhaps reference architectures, but certainly, although they need to be governed as well, but design patterns and reference implementations as certain, for example, in technology, as certain technology products come in and out of favor, again, a reference implementation may need to be contained and deprecated because it references technologies that were similarly containing and deprecating. However, at the reference architecture level, we want to, you know, govern that life cycle because, again, they need to be proposed. They need to be approved for development because there's certainly a whole host of reference architectures that could be development, so we need to have some way to do some prioritization. Once those architectures have been approved for development, then we need to go through some kind of solutioning life cycle around gathering requirements, you know, putting together the solution, and then we have to actually package it and make it available to the enterprise. But then, you know, as that reference architecture evolves, we may subsequently retire that because we've come up with a new way of doing it, or there's been some disruptive technology that really wants us to think about doing stuff a completely different way. So hopefully that answers the question about the reference architecture lifecycle. And let's see if we may have another question or so. And this will be, again, you know, kind of a continuation of previous questions, but related to a future topic is, again, I think we really need to be thoughtful about, you know, we've observed a lot of organizations making non-trivial investments, all for the right reasons, in governance and, you know, trying to manage technology, for example, but often finding that those processes, because of how they're implemented and perceived, have barriers to entry that really dissuade people from wanting to interact with those processes because they don't really understand, well, what's in it for me? I mean, I get what you get out of it. You know, you learned about a new product. You now have an opportunity to decide whether we should use it or not. But by the way, we're using it because the project's going live in 3 months. So we need to make sure that we have a good understanding of this reference model, reference architecture content has to be accessible very rapidly to people. And that's, again, a future topic as it relates to asset reuse and consumption. And it's based on the whole idea that people have to be able to find this stuff in order to possibly be useful. Once they find it, they have to be able to determine if it actually is useful. And if it is useful, then they actually have to figure out a way to inject it into their environments in a meaningful way very rapidly. And we see a lot of organizations really struggle with that downstream part of the architecture lifecycle. There's a lot of emphasis on that upfront content management and creating all these models, but not a lot on how people are supposed to use and consume that. So of course we've got some provocative ideas on how to overcome some of those barriers and obstacles. So I think Birgit, we're pretty much at the top of the hour.
Yes, we are. Thank you all for attending, and Chris, thank you for an excellent presentation, and there were some really great questions. Wanted to say this session is recorded and will be available on the AEA site. I'll send out a link to that soon. Thank you all. Chris, thank you.
Thank you very much.